It definitely added to putting all the puzzle pieces together to come to the realization that she couldn't have done any better. She simply didn't have the genetic makeup, the experience to feel like there was a different way.
That is Joshua Haynes, the guest for today's episode. In today's episode, you'll hear Joshua share the story of when he struggled to empathize with his mother. He also shares the journey he's gone through with his mental illness. Not an easy topic to discuss in a public forum. Join me in holding space for Joshua to reflect honestly. Welcome to the journey of realizing empathy. I think we all have experienced the moment in our lives when we suddenly empathize with somebody we previously did not by experiencing a moment of realization. One where we went, aha, oh, or maybe even burst out with laughter concerning something we either did not or had incorrectly assumed to understand and appreciate enough. While these realizations can sometimes be had in a few minutes, it can also take years. In fact, it may never happen. It is a seemingly simple yet complex and lifelong process of realizing empathy that I wish to explore in all of our episodes. Hey there, listener. My name is Slim. I help startup founders in their maturation as a leader and a CEO by helping them confront themselves in a true mirror. And I believe few things serve as a truer mirror than the challenges we face in our interactions with other people. The Journey of Realizing Empathy is a show where we explore how our challenges with other people can ultimately serve as a true mirror that helps us mature as leaders and human beings. In each of our episodes, we host a guest who tells a story of a time in their life when they struggled to empathize with one or more people until a series of realizations moved them to empathize with those very people. Welcome, Joshua.
Thank you so much, Slim. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Would you be willing to briefly introduce yourself?
Certainly. So I'm Joshua Haynes. I am human, and I live alongside my husband and our two children in Berlin, Germany.
Awesome. So I just want to make sure that I don't forget to acknowledge how much I appreciate your willingness to be on the show.
Well, thank you.
Because I think one of the things we're living through is a time where empathy, it's on the media all the time.
Sure.
And in some passion, it's become politicized. It's also become weaponized to some degree. And it's far easier and comfortable to talk about how much empathy we have, how wonderful and compassionate of people we are, than to actually talk about the struggles we have with empathy. In some ways, it takes a small yet significant amount of bravery at this day and age to actually talk about this topic. So I just don't want to take that for granted. So I really appreciate your willingness to be on the show. Thank you.
Thank you for those important words.
Thank you. All right. So frame the conversation today for us. Which relationship would you like to focus on for today's conversation?
So I'd like to focus on the relationship that I have with my mother.
Okay, great. Excellent. So would you be willing to roll back the time to a point in your life where you believe would be a good place to start the story?
So this is late August 1997. I'm getting in the car of a friend that I had known for years. I actually had lived with her and her family for a period of 6 weeks in the previous year. She's driving me to the airport. I had just left the home of where my mother was living on the way to be an exchange student in Germany after having won a congressional scholarship to study abroad for my last year of high school. And there are tears in my eyes because I feel that it's finally, I've done it. I've broken free from the cyclical issues of poverty and the inability really to be loved or cared for in a way that I felt was needed. It was at that point 17 years of having been with and raised by and living with, I use raised by lightly, my mother, my dear mother, who certainly wasn't the best at raising children, we'll say. I went to 6 high schools in 3 years. We moved around a lot because we couldn't pay the bills. I spent most of my childhood on welfare. Some low points where when I didn't have shoes anymore in probably 4th or 5th grade, I was wearing her Reeboks and the kids made fun of me. So she felt, of course, some sadness of that. And of course, I was probably ballistic knowing me that why can't I have the other things like the other kids have? And she took some of our food stamps, so coupons that the government would give us to purchase food, and paid someone she knew in food stamps for a pair of stolen shoes so I could have shoes. That's just one of many instances of really her inability to be responsible for raising children. Now, I was born when she was in her late 30s. As I understand it, she had a miscarriage before in her previous marriage. And then she had 2 other children before that from various marriages, both of whom, for the most part, grew up and were raised by either their fathers or someone else. But I got to or had to stay with my mother. There wasn't someone that I could be pawned off to necessarily. Now, I think it's important to put a little more context, especially over that grim story that I've just talked about her in a few insights. She was also an incredibly compassionate and caring person. She was very good at getting through life and finding people to take care of her because of her good looks, her wit, her intelligence. She worked in Alcoholics Anonymous clubs, bingo. She ran a bingo parlor that was associated with the AA system. Yeah. She also had her own issues continually with alcohol, given her how she was raised and brought up and just some of her issues. Later on, she worked and cared for people with traumatic brain injuries as being a caregiver, just somebody there to be in the homes with these people. But the reason why I was crying on that day in 1997, because I felt that finally I had broken free. I was lucky to have been good at school, despite having moved around so much. I was lucky that I was in the system that, at least in the US where I grew up, rewards those who are academically talented. Right. And so I just felt this big sense of relief for what she had, for what I was finally being able to get away from.
This is your lucky break, so to speak, at the time.
Certainly. Absolutely.
Wow. And what happens next?
Yeah. So I'm an exchange student in Germany with a great family. The first time I had been in a nuclear family, 2 parents, 4 siblings, and had a year of normalcy where I wasn't moving around, where I wasn't having to worry about food or having to, before then I had worked at 3 different McDonald's and a Pizza Hut to be able to pay for what we needed to. It was just a nice reset and hint or harbinger of what would be possible, what would be able to come. And all through that, I was fortunate to also get accepted and get scholarships to go to university, and then had a couple of different careers. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco. I was in software development. And this is also when my mother was living. And it was actually in 11 years after that first date, so in 2008, when I had just gotten to China to study Chinese for the summer, that my mom passed away.
Oh.
And so there was a big decision to make in terms of, well, do I come home? Now, at that point, she wasn't living with my sister, but my sister was essentially making sure that she was okay. At that point, she was living off of the little disability she got, and then also funds that I and my sister were providing to her. And I thought, well, what would she want? Would she want me to go home? And she would, of course, not wanted that. Because something my mother also gave me was unfettered access to knowledge, to experience. There wasn't once when she said, no, you can't do that, Joshua. You can't do that. You are destined to do great things. That's a great thing to tell a child. It's also an awful thing to tell a child, because then you get it in your head that you come hell or high water, that you better change the world or you fail.
Right.
She was very supportive. But I felt there was just this disconnect, really, from the time when I had to, in 6th grade, call family friends, and then my brother, who's 18 years older than me, living in a different state.
Wait, so these are brothers from
my mother's side,
yeah,
from her previous marriages, and calling my 18-year-old elder brother and saying something has to happen. She's incredibly drunk. It's just a cycle that we can't live in anymore. From that moment, all the way even before she died. I had tried a couple of times to understand why didn't you try to take some type of responsibility or try to provide or not just do everything from the seat of our pants. Her favorite saying was, don't sweat the small stuff, and it's all small stuff.
Wait, so give us an example of the kind of things that you wish that she had taken responsibility for.
Right. Just not having to move every year and a half or 2 years, or being in a situation where I felt in high school I needed to go and live with family friends or with my own friends' families. Having to sleep for the last year and a half of high school on the couch of my mom's boss because it was a better school system than the house that she was living in, taking care of people with traumatic brain injury.
Wait, how does this happen? Like, is she actively telling you like, oh, from tonight on for the next 2 weeks, you're going to sleep here? Or how is this happening?
No, it's mainly driven on probably by me, by knowing that this is a much better school system. I'm already involved. I've already been to how many, by that point it was the sixth high school I'd been to. And I'm lucky, I'm charming. I have a good rapport with adults because I've had to all my life. And so it wasn't that much of putting someone out to have me be there on the couch. And it was more like family, living with my mom's supervisor, her boss at the time.
So you knew them in advance. And
Sure.
Then one night, maybe you go back home and you notice that your mother is maybe drunk and she's not in a particularly good state. Then you know to call somebody that you already know, whether it's your mom's boss or your family friend or your friend or whomever, and say, you know what, I think it'd be better for me to sleep over at your place tonight than to stay at home. Is that the kind of thing that happens?
Yeah, certainly. I think it comes in big chunks. I think that was the one time in sixth grade where there was a spate. I don't know if it was a year or 2 years of frequent inebriation on her part. To then just understanding that there isn't a physical space in the house where she's living for me to have a place to stay. And it was probably my suggestion. I was already involved in clubs and in the band. And when I moved from the fifth high school, where I was not living with my mother, I was living with a family friend at the time, to then moving to her boss's house, it was known that I was going to be living at her boss's house, and my mother wouldn't be there necessarily all the time. But that was fine for me because I hardened the relationship, because I also felt that it was really hard for me to talk to her and open up about things. Now, I'm in my early 40s, and in my 30s had to deal with a lot of my own personal mental illness that I had because of life and childhood and et cetera. It wasn't until I was able to process that to get some type of closure on our relationship. Yeah.
Wow. So let's pause here for a second, because I don't want to rush through this. If you're willing, I just want to check in. What emotions are you feeling at this moment, having told this chunk of the story so far?
Yeah. So ones of agitation. Why did this have to happen? Why was it that when I went to university and most of my friends were at least middle class, well off, there were so many experiences that they had that I didn't know what a mortgage was. I didn't know how that worked. There's all kinds of things I didn't understand just in the way the world worked. I'm feeling, I know how the story ends. So I'm feeling content.
That's always a light at the end of the tunnel kind of a thing.
Exactly. At least how this part of the story is where I am today. Right. Yeah.
So just to make sure that I'm understanding, the context is, on the one hand, you talked about the side of your mother that is very compassionate. She's actively helping other people. She's running these social gatherings for people who are in AA groups. She's also actively caring for other people who's in need. And she also, says and demonstrates the notion of wanting something that's best for you. It sounds like you were traveling a lot and moving from different places, and never once so she will be like, well, you should stay with me because of XYZ reasons. None of those things are happening. She genuinely wants something that's best for you. At the same time, there's another side where you're talking about the fact that she still has issues with alcohol. So there are times when she's inebriated and you're living a quote unquote normal life in the sense that you're going to school. But while that thread is stable, everything else is just constantly changing. Like you're having to move from one place to another. And then you might have to live not in your own home, which would be a kind of a typical way in which most people live. You're making judgments about, oh, you know what? For whatever reason, there's not even a physical space for me to be here. So you're trying to figure out, okay, How should I live? So I'm going to figure out a way for me to live. And thankfully, I've made some relationships with my mother's boss or family friends or my own friends. And you have enough rapport with them to actually reach out to them and say, I think it's better for me to stay with you. It sounds like in some cases, weeks or months, or maybe years. I don't know.
More than a year.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that more or less accurate? Are the things I'm missing?
Yeah. If you look at the beginning until when I was in sixth grade, things were relatively okay. She had a stable job. There was at one point she even had a mortgage, but then her mother passed away, and I think that was a trigger for her to start to getting to drinking again. Now, mind you, my parents met in rehab. I think my mother might have met most of her husbands in rehab. It's a great place, I hear. And so then in the period of from 6 to 12 is where it's just the two of us, no external help. And so 12, 13, 14, I'm actually living with my brother and his family, and then my mother comes at some point. And then we're back on our own. I go to my father's, but then he pushes me away. That's another story for the next step. And then in high school, it's the moving, because either she can't hold down a job or there's no space for me. So it's just a lot of tumultuousness and a lot of ever changing adaptation that's needed. And then culminating in that, yes, having gotten the scholarship and then knowing that I was gone. I had survived. Yeah.
I have a whole new level of appreciation for when you said relief earlier on. The journey that you've been on is one that you've arrived somewhere where now is some semblance of stability, right? Sure. Ironically, in a country that you've never lived, nonetheless. But as ironic as that might sound, there is sense to the madness that you are in a country and you're actually taking control and responsibility for your life, in the sense that this is something that you've pursued and you've actually gotten it. And now that you've gotten it, you've made a decision to make the most of it. And based on the fact that you mentioned how you're academically performing, this is probably also a chance in which you can focus and really hunker down and test yourself or challenge yourself to do the best that you possibly can. Does that resonate?
Sure. Yes. Yeah, I think that's a fair way of putting it. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Excellent. Take us to the next step.
Yeah. So the relationship we had was one of me calling initially a couple of days, couple of weeks, and saying, "Hey, what, how are you? How are things happening?" Whether she was in and out of jobs. I think the period then starts until her death, so 11 years later, in 2008. That was about a check-in. And when I was younger, after, for example, there was a period when she was then living with my sister after I came home from Germany before going to university. I was there with her and my sister for the summer. Right. And so I think there was one summer I came back in college. And at that point, she was living with my brother. You see the pattern. But it really wasn't a close relationship. The conversation topics that we had just were incredibly superficial. And that really frustrated me. Because
what frustrated you?
What I was experiencing, which parallels even growing up, the things I was experiencing or going through, she couldn't relate to. Or she didn't have the capacity to understand what that meant in the larger sense. When I was going through puberty, it was my fourth grade teacher who gave me a brown bag of deodorant and let me know what was happening. It's like the wherewithal, okay, this is what's happening next year. Let me be your coach and be there for you. Yeah. She really wasn't there. And so I felt like the relationship was calloused. Also during that period, until my early 30s, I was ashamed of my history, my upbringing, the unconventionalness of it, that my father had 7 wives and my mother had 5 husbands, and that there were all these half siblings everywhere, and then the welfare and this, and then so I didn't want to let people know into that because I wanted to seem normal, like you expect people to do when you come across them. And
So all this time, although the conversation is superficial, it sounds like you still felt motivated to keep in touch.
Oh, yeah, of course. I felt the responsibility because, because at the end of the day, she was my mother and I loved her dearly, because as the older I got, I also became more grateful for the skills that she did instill in me, the sense of perseverance and grit that, if I was able to get through the first 17 years of my life, everything else is going to be a cakewalk. That's such an American thing. Sorry, I'm just thinking about that.
But in comparison, it does resonate.
That's certainly. It's easy. Also, just my ability to change and adapt and be a bit of a chameleon, and which wasn't just because I had done it. I had come to thrive in it, getting to a point where some of how I dealt with my insecurities and issues and just frankly getting bored at what I was doing was to escape to a new culture, to a new language, to a new person, because that was the continuation of the pattern that had existed. And so that was great because there aren't many Americans that speak a lot of languages or have lived and traveled. Not very many who grew up on welfare either. Yeah. So yes, that's great. That's been super helpful for a lot of the work that I have done. But also at the same time, it's hard in terms of building and forming really strong relationships with people. Because then what happens is the relationship becomes transactional, a two-dimensional relationship. And so when you need it to be a three-dimensional relationship, when you can trust that they'll still be there for you, even if you're not doing something to please them or to ingratiate yourself to them, that's okay too. And so that's some of the downside of that.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned that part where even though you're not doing anything to please them, they're still going to be there. As simple as that sounds, I think if we really become honest with ourselves and really sit down and went through our relationships and said, if we're going to be useless to this person the next day, the chance of that person actually staying in our relationship, how high is that? And I think we start to really winnow down what the true relationships we have are. And in a sense, in your formative years, when you go abroad and start to really, in college years, I guess, is that when you moved? These are still times when you're forming really important friendships. And what you're talking about is that even though this was very formative years when you're supposed to be building these sort of stable relationships, because of the fact that these were short times that you're going to be in that country and you would soon leave, it was very difficult to form that kind of relationship. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, long lasting, where it was nothing more than just honestly usury or manipulation. Right, where it was just, okay, I'm here now. This is what I need, and I know how to get it from people, and so then I'm gonna leave. Yeah.
So, what were the experiences like when you went abroad?
I remember first getting to Germany. Of course, the first country I had ever been to. I hadn't traveled hardly at all. Just the architecture was different. The signage was different. Like right. The feeling of inside the buildings had this unique smell.
Yeah.
That was. Yeah. I later was then able to equate it and to the culture, the language, the viewpoint of how Germans, particularly, or any other cultures, view life. When I lived in Morocco, it was also fascinating. Like the juxtaposition between the external, a lot of things are dirty or it's chaotic, and you go inside the internal, and it's beautiful, immaculate, super clean. That was just amazing, and that's also imitated in the language and the culture and et cetera. Or spending time in China and just being blown away by the sea of people on our bikes as we're undulating through this. And it's just, and there's no crashes, there's no nothing. People are just, it is there. Or being able to go by a construction site and see the scaffolding there, and then come by at the end of the day, come back, and it be gone because of the building had been torn down, like completely. And everything, and this economy from all the different layers, there was a use and a specific purpose for every nail, for every, amazing. It's beautiful. Or to be, I'm gonna keep going, sorry. To working in villages in Niger, in West Africa, one of the poorest countries in the world, but the people with the biggest hearts and the most gracious and grateful people that I've ever met, really taught me a lot, and all these different cultures really taught me a lot about me growing up as a very traditionally white guy in the US and in middle or southwestern United States. It's just the things we take for advantage and the value that we put on things. And the why is all this? Yeah.
And looking back, it would have been hard for you to fathom at the time, but looking back and having moved very quickly across all these countries and having become accustomed to these things, what do you think it meant for you at the time to be able to go through all these countries and to have these experiences?
Yeah. I think it was one of, again, intrigue and understanding how did other people in similar situations, because even from the second I won that scholarship, I was incredibly grateful that I lived in a country that had that type of education system, and I had won the lottery in terms of where I was born. It didn't matter that I grew up on welfare. I was raised by a single mom. And so that was out of that sense of wanting, and what I understood to, at that point, the idea of giving back, wanting to give back. That's one of the reasons. First, I knew, in college, I studied for a semester again in Germany, and then I wanted to learn Spanish. But instead of going to Spain, I wanted to go to a developing country. And so decided to go to Ecuador because I wanted just to be amongst that and understand how some of those systems dynamics worked. I'm very glad I did that. But then I felt like also I wanted to give back. So I had studied international finance in university, a bit ironic. Like this kid who grew up on welfare, like finance, stock market, economics, like all these things. And this money making, at the point that was very much just about money making and returns and risk rates. But knowing I loved the math and the algorithms that were behind it. Just I loved learning the math and algorithms behind languages. But I wasn't helping anyone. And so I decided to join the Peace Corps and go to Morocco and quote unquote help. Of course, I didn't help anybody. I was helped, as it traditionally is the case. But just being able to be and live in those societies. And I guess it was because for so long I felt I didn't have a culture. We didn't have traditions at home. There were very few foods, for example, that I remember my mother cooking. Everything was just by the seat of our pants, but wanting to be able to experience all of those centuries of traditions that existed in the various places where, and then at some point it gets addicting. I get to the point is, so I'm on my fourth, my fifth, my sixth language. And that's where I get my high, because I have others from external groups extolling me for having done this thing that I just was also lucky genetically to be good at learning languages, because I worked hard necessarily. It's something I love. And so that was like, that's another way I can get them to recognize me, to acknowledge me. And that was important, that acknowledgement. And that's something even today, one of the top, I don't know how many, couple of handfuls of things that I'm still working on is really being able to unpack of that acknowledgement of, am I loved? Am I recognized? Do I have importance?
Yes, that you matter.
Yep.
And I get the sense that it's something that all human beings crave, but in some ways I find it refreshing that you're willing to admit it.
Yeah.
Because more often than not, I think it's actually a lot harder for people to come to the awareness to just admit the fact that I want to be loved, that I want to be acknowledged, that I want to be appreciated and validated. And I think one of the things that we live in the culture is this idea of, once we become, I don't know what the adjective is, like strong or whatever the image is, we're no longer going to need this appreciation or validation or acknowledgement or recognition. But at the same time, if you imagine anybody's life, even if the person has like the most noble or virtuous life any man could possibly imagine, if that every single day that person feels like they don't matter, that they're completely unacknowledged, I start to wonder what exactly that would look like. Does that resonate at all with you?
Finally, that there's a precipice after which we don't have to worry about mattering anymore.
Right.
No, most indubitably. And if you look at today's societal issues, climate change, social inequality, economic inequities, et cetera, like you can boil them all down to this fundamental need to consume more, to feel better that somebody's acknowledged me on social media, to produce more, to feel that I'm better than the other vis-a-vis my power, my wealth, right? It's all comes down to essentially our mental health, our mental wellness, which after it took me quite a while to be able to make these transformations and statements and put the system together. But that's one of the driving force around what I've dedicated my life to now. And that is essentially in investing in organizations that are focused on increasing access to mental wellness and doing it from a way of ensuring and focusing on their own mental wellness and the team's mental wellness first, because it's this idea of mental health. Of course, it's a huge problem, exacerbated by this little thing called Corona.
A huge amplifier.
It's a huge amplifier and agitator. Holy moly! But it was still, even before the virus, was such an issue that, again, we can't talk about because of our cultures, because of the stigma, because I'm a man, I shouldn't, because I'm this, because I can't just open the lid and say, this is who I am. These are my vulnerabilities. Live with it or get on with your life. And so that's, I think, really, it took me my 30s having to break down. I was also fortunate to be a diplomat in the Obama administration for a number of years, working through the U.S. Agency for International Development. Got to go to more countries and got to do amazing different things and systems work around technology and human rights, et cetera. But I never once had really dug deep inside of me to understand what was it and why was I doing this and why was this so important to me. Nor, in that same breath, asking that same questions of my counterparts, whether they be social entrepreneurs in Cambodia starting new companies, to heads of state who were trying to push through policies, never really saying what is it that they're trying to cover up or take advantage of based on these three fundamental issues that we all need, the sense for belonging and safety. And so it wasn't through that process, which is part of my process of healing about the relationship I had with my mom, and eventually becoming okay with that. I realized this opportunity and the need to more holistically look at how capital and finance is pushed into areas around increasing access to mental wellness.
Wow. So I want to roll back a little bit and highlight one of the words that you used earlier, which is give back, right? You joked about the irony of you majoring in international finance and such. You're talking about coming from poverty and then having to cope with the situations with your family and trying to do your best to navigate your own academic challenges and find your path through it. Where would the desire to give back come from? Because one could also imagine a person who goes through the exact same thing and say, I'm going to get everything for myself. I'm going to make sure that I'm never going to be worrying about anything, whether and anything relates to money or anything related to safety. I'm just going to make sure I'm going to have complete protection over my walls and never, ever have to trust anybody and never, ever rely on anybody. I'm just going to all fend for myself. That's also a possible outcome. Where does the divergence happen for you?
It was from the persistent, ever-present compassion that I had growing up. My mom's vis-a-vis me or towards others. Like that fact that it's more valuable and you get more sense of worth from helping others than helping yourself. Right? Again, a double-edged sword. You got to first help yourself before you can help others, and then you feel good like you're doing something. But I think that's really, if you look at her life, she had amazing her self-compassion, just an inability for responsibility. And so those, especially with the compassion, just driving through that into me, not from, she never talked about it, but just the small things she would do for neighbors. Or when friends would come to her and say, I need this, yes, she would give them everything off of her, the clothes off of her back to help people. Also, I guess at some point, the implicit realization that she was right. It all does work out. Like, we don't need to sweat the small stuff because it's all small stuff.
So talk a little bit more to that realization that it is really the small stuff, and don't sweat the small stuff.
Of course, when those quips would come up growing up, and even when I was in my early 20s, trying to understand where she's coming from and why the action she took, and it would infuriate me. Don't sweat the small stuff. It's all small stuff. And by the way, she didn't use the word stuff. I don't want to curse on your...
I will guess.
On this podcast. Yeah. And then realizing that, wait, it all works out. Look at what we've been able to do and get over. And yes, it was hard. And there were moments of breakdown. There was effects on my personal physical aspects. I developed, because of how I was raised, an eating disorder, binge eating disorder, and have spent my entire life dealing with food and the power and the replacement that food gives me vis-a-vis other relationships. I need to stop saying vis-a-vis. It sounds like I'm educated. And so it's that had a physical effect on me. But I also now am in a point where I know exactly what I need to do. And it wasn't, if I hadn't had those sorrows or the suffering, then I wouldn't be at a position where I am now. So very fortunate, because honestly, it's not about happiness or the pursuit of happiness. It's really about the pursuit for balance and knowing that we're not going to grow unless it hurts, and necessary suffering is important.
Yeah.
It's the unnecessary that we as a society can help to reduce.
Yeah. The analogy that pops into my head is how muscles develop, right?
Sure.
We think we just somehow magically grow muscles because we work out. But and when you actually look at the biology, what actually happens is when you work out, you actually hurt your muscles.
Yeah.
They tear, literally they tear. And then it's only when you recover through nutrition or hormones and other things, that when it repairs those tissues through the support of those nutrients and hormones and all those things, that's when the muscle actually develops. And in some ways, the story that you're just talking about, how the fact that you've survived, and once again, I think it's very important that we don't diminish that word.
Sure.
Because we're now living in a world where we're supposedly supposed to thrive, because apparently survival is not good enough. Because that's somehow, you don't want to survive, you want to thrive. Like now we have a ranking system on how to live life, basically. But what you're talking about, the point that you're mentioning is, yes, it was difficult. Yes, it was painful. Yes, there was hurt. But you survived through them. And because you were able to survive through them, and you were also able to go through your own healing journey when you're recovering things in your own ways, the hurt that you experienced also became a part of your growing process. Sure. Does that resonate?
Absolutely.
When you look back at your past experiences with your mother and the growth that has happened, besides the compassion aspect you just mentioned, what comes up to you as the crucible, if you will, like the formidable moments that you remember as really having helped you grow and develop and mature to the person that you are now?
So I think her death was an important one. And I feel actually lucky that I was in, again, a different country, one that wasn't my own, and able to process that my own terms.
From a distance, you mean?
From a distance, yeah. And I think also, as I started on the journey to deal with my own issues with mental health, digging deep to understand where they came from in that process and exercise, having the discussions with my sister, for example, and really diving into her opinion and her thoughts on what happened with my mom, and really coming to this understanding of she simply wasn't given the tools to be responsible. This was very apparent when she was a child and a teenager. She was the pretty one. She was the one that either her aunt or her mother or would want to fight over to have and stay with them and be the nice thing to show off to people. Even at that point when my aunt, who I never met, she died when she was 21, knew with her then husband that they would have to take care of my mom when they got older, just because she needed somebody to take care of her.
You mean from a young age, as a child?
From a young age, yeah. People knew that she would have to be, and I didn't understand this until I was going through my process and understanding and trying to uncover what had happened. And so that was one of probably, a number of, I wouldn't say like this light bulb, aha, this is it. She just wasn't capable moments, but it definitely added to putting all the puzzle pieces together to come to the realization that she couldn't have done any better. She simply didn't have the genetic makeup, the experience to feel like there was a different way.
Was there any precedence? Was there something running in the family that led to this, and any other sort of indications?
So, not that I'm aware of in terms of her, for example, illness or any specific issues with genetics that would have come through. I know that it was said that when she was born, they noticed that there was a plate in her brain that didn't cover all the way. So it was a large soft spot. Over time, It did grow, but there was something there. And if you just think about how she had to either be taken care of by various husbands or her friends or her bosses, or when I was working at Pizza Hut and paying for everything as an 10th grader, yeah. That's just how she had to be.
Wow. So it's one thing for a child to recognize very obviously that one's mother cannot take responsibility. Like, for example, if she seems physically disabled or something like that. It's quite another for you to see the compassionate and caring and out there organizing social gatherings and highly functioning, to use the lingo, and then to have this gap where you're like, wait, there's this one part that just doesn't make any sense. Like, how could those two seemingly completely opposite ends coexist at the same time? And the puzzle pieces that you're talking about is as you're having conversations with, I guess, your sister, when your mother passed away, starts to put the puzzle pieces together. Is that the thing that's happening with your mother's death?
Sure.
Huh.
That started that, putting things together. And then just suddenly, like the callus being worn down.
What do you mean by callus?
So a callus, that hard skin that develops after you get a wound, the callus that I felt had been just in my disposition towards her and how she raised me, and the irresponsibility with which she raised me. That hard exterior set of feelings begins to dissolve.
What kind of feelings were they, the calluses that built up?
It was regret, like a sense of audaciousness, like how could she have done that?
Like
put us in a position? Yeah, absolutely. Resentment, just feeling deep emotions of disadvantagement. If that's a word. That not having an equal footing in life, that need to resenting having to overcompensate for so many things.
For so many years.
Yeah, for so many years. Yeah.
So that started to dissolve.
Yeah, absolutely. Because then at that point, it was also, I think I was in parallel coming and becoming more appreciative of what I did have and the flip side of the advantages I had over other people. I didn't have parents who made me go to soccer and violin and piano. And I wanted to be in the math club and compete at the state level in math competitions, as geeky as that sounds. I wanted to be in the band. I wanted to do all this. And I didn't have to because my parents thought. I could have decided to study, or not even go to university. That was never a question. I just knew always growing up I was going to go to university because that's what I was going to do. But it didn't, there was no ever any pressure, zero whatsoever on me. Yeah.
Wow, it almost sounds like you developed a hyper ability to take responsibility in the absence of your mother who could not take responsibility.
Sure. Yeah.
Does that resonate?
Yeah, because I had to, just to be able to just survive initially and to be able to cope and become a chameleon and get what I needed to out of the situation to move on to the next thing. Certainly.
Wow. What other puzzle pieces started to come together at the time of your mother's death? Because I don't want to make it sound like all of a sudden overnight everything became appreciative.
No.
It's like I just have all these eureka appreciations. Like probably not the way it worked out. Do share.
And it wasn't just that the event; it was also the ensuing 5-6 years of dealing with. I think initially a lot of it was just trying to push that away. That didn't exist.
What away?
Push the relationship I had with my mother, the feelings, a lot of these issues.
Before it started to dissolve, you wanted to push it away.
Exactly.
Got it.
Because I didn't want, right? That was still at a time when I wasn't, very few people knew about my history or understood where I was coming from. It's not something I wore on my sleeve. And I think really at the same time of me coming to terms with my own issues, the internal side, and starting to unpack those is when then I was more receptive to understanding the root causes for how she was and how she led her life. And so it was like a healing both for me and then also healing for us.
The relationship.
Yeah.
And how did you go about taking a step towards your own healing?
Yeah. So I think I was just at a point, I was probably at the heaviest I had been in terms of weight. I'd reached that a couple of times, starting from middle school. But just knowing there was something deep-seated that I was functionally successful in the work that I was doing and getting the accolades and the attention that I was seeking, but I just wasn't happy. And it broke down, and the kind of a mini breakdown at the beginning for the first time, and started seeing a psychotherapist.
When was this? Around what age were you?
This is 34.
And this is before your mother's
35?
death? 35.
This is after. This is 6 years after she died.
Okay.
Yeah. And so then through psychotherapy now, mind you, I thought only rich people went to therapy. So why the hell was I going to go to therapy? But at that point, I had a very good income. And life was good. I couldn't complain. And that was an important window to start unpacking a lot of the relationship issues with everything, as one might do in psychotherapy. So that put me on a good set. And also at that point, I was also on antidepressants, SSRIs, which also in that moment helped, was an important key in that first phase. Now, that happened. I moved a country. We also then, at that point, my husband and I we had one child, and then we adopted our second child. And then I had big decisions to make in terms of what was I doing? Was I going to go back to the United States? Was I going to go someplace else?
Where were you physically, geographically at the time?
So that was Sweden.
Sweden. Okay. Wow. You're all over the place. Okay. So you were deciding whether to go back to the United States or not. Okay.
Yeah. And so deciding, at that point, honestly, did we want to work? Did I want to work in the Trump administration? I was still in the government at that time. Did I want to go back to what I had been doing before, or did I need to escape and go something new? And so then we decided to move to Berlin. And so shortly after, I had an interesting job, but I really wasn't in the right position in the place. I was let go from the job, primarily my own issues with it, and just crashed and burned.
Say crashed and burned, meaning?
So my the depression was the worst it's ever been. There were some points where I had a hard time getting out of bed, just the feelings of inadequacy, not having accomplished anything, being completely useless. And I needed quite some time to get over that and to start looking at what are the different approaches, not just psychotherapy and pharmacological approaches, but what are other approaches, whether it be nutrition, which has been for me a lifesaver in terms of I know what I put in my body exactly has that determination of how my mind acts and feels. Meditation, mindfulness, natural medicines from various traditions, whether it be Eastern medicine, Vedic traditions, shamanistic traditions, to exercise, nutrition, people, all of the various things that have existed for a long time, but they're out there. Now, that are becoming somewhat on vogue, and that's another
yes
conversation for another program.
Right.
Yeah, just count your breath. Okay, count your breath. Yeah, keep counting your breath. Count. But then also started to look and got really excited about, and this is when I'm open just to the fact that I'm not the only one who has this experience. Many other people have had much worse experience even than I have had. And I was incredibly lucky. I was never abused. I was never physically, mentally, sexually. I am lucky now understanding the stats, and especially in the situations in which I grew up. But seeing that there's also so much more innovation that's happening in terms of technology and just approaches. And there are more people who are willing to be more vulnerable, even as leaders, with who they are and how they lead their organizations, which is an important trend that hopefully it won't just
be a trend.
Be a trend. And it's just the talk of, I'm vulnerable because I had a hard time at band camp, or investment club, whatever it was that I was in high school, right? Yeah.
Wow. So the initial trigger was your mother's death, but there were conversations that were happening because she had passed away. And then part of like a domino effect from those conversations is that you had an opportunity to look inwards, to see yourself in the mirror and try to understand, like, what's going on with me? Like, why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? Why am I doing the things that I'm doing? Why am I making meaning of the things in the way that I'm making meaning? Things of that sort. Were there any other aspects that were happening at the same time?
Sure. And I think the approach was taken, it was using the same approach I had done with learning languages or learning how to write software or working in different systems, is that I compartmentalized or variabilized I was, and then tried to understand systematically all the different inputs, where it come from. So I'm looking at second, third orders of derivations, whether it be my mom, where did she come? What was her issues? My father, same thing with issues. And then looking at, okay, what's happening when I'm able to understand a bit more about who I am, and then look at that first relationship issues, look in other areas. And just from my dealings in my life, I could go and rewind the tape and say, okay, this is what happened in this situation, and try to assess why was that? What were the underlying issues and reasons there? And that actually gave me a lot of interesting, there's opportunity here. There's something we can do here. Whether focusing a lot on now is the approach about how the power that comes with money is used. So why Is it that if I'm an investor, that I feel I only have to squeeze you and squeeze all the money out and all the humanity out of you as a founder, as a company, as an organization? And because it's just such a caustic relationship. But what if we were balanced? There was one element of the funds and the assistance, sure, but also that you played a similar role in that. And I think there's so much, that's another thing we could talk about for years, just the opportunity for what happens when you reset those relationship equations, the balance of that relationship. It's something I'm incredibly excited about.
That's a very interesting route to arrive at investment of all places from a traditional system. So that was a bit of a jump. So how did that transition happen? I guess it was like around 2016 or something along those lines, where you were at your lowest and then you're going through psychotherapy. From there, how do you arrive at the world of investment with the kind of mission that you have now?
Sure. So I think it's essentially this realization first internal. I have issues. What are my issues? Okay, figuring out what are my specific bespoke approaches that I need to take to deal with these issues. Then opening my eyes a little bit more to say, okay, I'm not the only one. There's lots of people. There's a hell of a lot of people who have the same.
How did you know that?
Some flavor. Just by looking at the stats, when you see that depression alone is the number one cause of disability before the virus.
Yeah.
Like, and you sit on that for a second and you say, wait, depression is disability? Wow. And you're able to derive what that really means, not only in terms of economic output and loss of productivity, but in terms of the social fabric and how that affects all the people who are taking care of people who are depressed, for example. And that's, and just like being like awestruck and kind of upset, angered that discussion isn't in the public arena, isn't in the public forum. And then having worked and supported in civil society, nonprofit policymaking arena, and understanding how that works, and a lot of and unpacking the intrinsic incentives for why people and organizations work the way they do, realizing that it isn't, this issues of mental illness isn't just a policy issue. It's not just a nonprofit issue. If we just work on advocacy, it's going to work. It's not just an investment issue. If we throw a heck of a lot of money at some apps, that we're all going to be okay. No, that's not going to work. And so it's actually figuring out there's this thread that is across the various different types and flavors, and trying to create a system, which we're still early and we still know very little, honestly, and we'll always know very little, and that's okay. To get over some of these huge impediments that are in the system that are preventing from us as humans to be open like we are today about where we are, where we're coming from, and to help drive more impact so that more people can simply have mental wellness and fully live life.
Yeah. So having those realizations, how does that necessarily naturally lead to you to go to investment?
Because there was this big hole that there wasn't the right type of investment happening in all these opportunities that were coming to fore, right? Sure, there's investors who are cherry picking here and here, but there were no individuals or organizations who were focusing on investing with an expectation that there's financial return and social return. Both go hand in hand, and they're mutual drivers of each other. And so that's where I didn't expect that I would be working in international finance when I studied international finance.
Very premonition, fresh interview.
Self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, Lord, my mother would be happy. But just, and now coming back to it, the things that really turned me away from finance and not even that, having worked in software development in really big companies, just this lack of humanity and this lack of the appropriate compassion and the appropriate empathy, not the weaponized empathy that is used in order to first realize where we are, and then everybody get in the boat and we'll figure this out together.
Yeah. Wow. Hell of a journey you've been on. Let's start there. First of all, thank you for having stayed alive. Because I mean, this is the kind of the journey that only makes sense in hindsight, right?
Sure.
Because it almost magically works in hindsight, because we're jokingly talking about you majoring in finance and all those things. Like somehow there is this closure of a loop happening. But when you're starting from forward looking, it just doesn't make any sense, so to speak. But then you leveraged the death of your mother as not merely as a period of grief, in some ways like a rebirth, if you will. Sure. Where you're struggling with your sense of identity of who you are, and by becoming more aware of who you are and then going through psychotherapy, you actually discovered a path for yourself in a very similar way that you were talking about earlier when you went off to overseas for college, where you're now taking responsibility for your life and saying, I have an opportunity to now actually study abroad and really take matters to my own hands and challenge myself in the academic sense that I would like to. So this also sounds like a kind of a second coming of that version where you're coalescing a more coherent sense of self for yourself. And then this means something to you in a very personal way, as well as in a social and a larger systemic way. Is that true?
Yes, most certainly. Yes, very well.
And what emotions do you feel with that on your shoulders?
So I feel supported. I feel, having had the journey and having the necessary experiences to know about the point from which I speak. I feel also so very well grounded, a sense of a fundament that really is there in terms of nurturing and nourishment. I also feel incredible sense of excitement for what is yet still to come. And just by being able to be open and lead through my own vulnerabilities and be incredibly transparent about where I'm not good. There's a lot of things I'm not good at, and that's completely okay. But that we get that out of the way already. Let's just get that out of the way so that we can focus on the things we can do, and then we trudge forward. So I feel excited, and I feel grateful for having had the journeys and the sinuous experiences that I have had.
Yeah. It's, once again, in hindsight, all those experiences now have tremendous value and tremendous meaning, in the sense that you can take any of the experiences you've had and derive infinite amounts of lessons from it. It's not like an anecdotal thing, like where you use it in order to communicate a more moral of the story. Is like, that's not where it's coming from. Like, you had the experience, and in hindsight, you're able to frame them in multiple different ways, because I'm sure as you spend the next decade of your life, you're going to look back at the same exact experience you've had and derive yet another layer of greater meaning and value. And so like, oh, wow, that meant this, and this now helps me look at the world in this way and that way. So it's like a gift that keeps on giving. Does that resonate?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so much more about the journey that's going on. And it's not about hitting a milestone or getting to a certain point or getting this, because what happens the day after the milestone comes, you keep going.
And yet another milestone.
Yeah. Oh, Lord. Yeah. And so I think that's super poignant from your side.
So earlier you used the phrase, I forget what the actual, I think by the seat of your pants. Like that's a phrase. The seat of your pants. Yeah. So that's like an improvisational thing, right? Like spontaneous response. Exactly. You said that multiple times. I'm curious, does that phrase have a particular meaning to you?
I think it roots in the colloquial Americana vernacular that I grew up with my mom and my sister, and I haven't unpacked what is the seat of your pants. Because what the hell does that mean? You're going to do it by the seat of your pants? That doesn't mean anything. You're going to take your pants off and cut it and then do something? Like, there's literally, I'll have to look at the origin. Right? Where does this come from? I think a part of it has to do with what's the gut or the instinct about what needs to happen when the situation arises. Realizing you can only plan so much. And the past might signal an indication of what's to come, but is never prescriptive. That's what I feel when I try to analyze that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And how would you say your understanding or appreciation of your experience with your mother developed over the years, besides that one instance you mentioned where she was physically unable to take responsibility?
Yeah. So I think just thinking back and trying to think back to the good times we had. And she was funny and irreverent, and really weaving a tight relationship between the good and the bad. Because for so long, it was when the calluses were there, it was just she didn't do this, or she was incapable of this and whatnot. And sure, I knew that the good stuff that was there. The very few things that she cooked, and when she cooked them, I still have those vivid memories of what that tasted like. And they weren't always good, but still. She was like a cook. But she was really good at bologna sandwiches. But even seeing that with a grain, or I mentioned weaving that together with the bad, so the good and the bad coming together, and realizing the importance of there being balance in that too. Because at some point in our conversation, I talked about feeling incredibly disadvantaged, and then at other points, incredibly advantaged because of how I grew up. And so just recognizing that balances out, and we shouldn't sweat it.
So it sounds like the transition is from remembering your past experiences with your mother as one of like disappointment, or why didn't she do this, et cetera, to the one where you are focusing more on the things that you actually appreciated, but at the time maybe you didn't appreciate. But if you actually really focus on it, in hindsight, it is something that you could have appreciated, but at the time you just didn't. What do you think helped that transition? Because that's, as simple as it sounds, that's a very difficult transition.
Sure. I think it was time and the ability to see her as a whole person, and not just as my mother.
Say more.
But as an entire human. The flaws and glitter and all, everything. And really try not to, without emotion, assess where she was coming from, without...
Like resentment?
Yeah, without putting any emotion in the analysis. So trying to be as emotionless as possible, to say very stoically, this is why she did what she did. This is what drove her. This was her motivation. This was the underlying needs she was trying to meet. And that gave a more complete picture of who she was and why she did what she did.
Yeah. So in some ways, it came to a place where her seemingly irrational or hard to understand behavior, understandable.
Sure.
You could actually make sense of these things because now you had a kind of a framework, if you will, or a trace that you can follow. If a human being has these needs, and if that's not fulfilled, it's not completely out of the norm for that person to behave in a way that is not to my liking or something along those lines. Is that what you mean?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that allows you to perceive your mother as a human being than merely your mother. So when you say merely your mother, what is that? What's the distinction?
Right. That's putting the relational arrow on me to her, me as child and her as mother, and only looks at it at a more myopic view as just the person who, yes, biologically she's my mother, but also relationally she's my mother, but doesn't really look at the other relationships that she had, nor did it have the relationship with herself. That's important too, and something that I think a lot of times we don't think about when we're looking at other people to understand, how do they actually view themselves? Were they capable? For example, my mother, I don't think she was capable of understanding and having that type of relationship with herself.
One that's more self-reflective.
Yeah, exactly.
And I wonder, because I was a little shocked when I heard that you were saying that your aunt passed away when she was 21. And at an earlier age, the aunt was expected to actually take care of your mother.
Yeah, she had determined. Yeah.
So who?
And this is her younger. Yeah.
So who were there when aunt passed away to support your mother?
My mother was first married when she was 15.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And she continually was married or being taken care of someone the entire time.
Wow. So was that also part of the understanding that you had, was no wonder she got married at 15. No wonder she had multiple people who she had to go for support, things of that sort.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and part of that understanding, what was the situation, the environment, the influences that she was dealing with.
What emotions do you feel most front and center when you remember your mother now?
So ones of joy and appreciation for her charisma and her humor, her wit, her irreverence.
Any other emotions?
Certainly gratefulness, indebtedness as well.
Wow. Indebtedness.
Which is certainly, if you just look at my story from the surface, isn't when you think that comes out. But
what would you say do you feel most indebted?
To her for having provided me with the experiences which forced me to grow in ways which aren't really common, to becoming used to not being dependent on a specific path, that you have to go from A to B to C in a linear fashion, that it can be as chaotic as it needs to be.
Yeah, in some ways, going back to the earlier theme of you had to take responsibility because your mother couldn't. And in some ways, you're saying when you take responsibility, one of the things that usually happen is, even though I'm willing to take responsibility, I don't know what's going to happen necessarily. There's absolutely no guarantee of outcome. I'm willing to do my best, but who knows what's going to come of this. And so when you take responsibility and do this and something comes of it and you're not exactly sure what to make of it just yet, and then you take another responsibility and do another thing, from the outside, it may seem that person is just jumping from one responsibility to another with no rhyme or reason kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But then part of what you're saying is because you're able to do that in chaotic fashion from the outside, as at least it looks like, when you accrue those experiences together, now that becomes a foundation for something that is much broader, if you will, because it connects so many dots in so many different areas. And it's able to withstand something of a larger scale. And it also has a depth because of the fact that you're going deep into the patterns that cuts across the wide variety of things that are going all around you. And at that point, without having had the previous experiences, you, with humility, admit that this could not have been possible.
Sure. Yeah.
And the level of value and meaning you reap from it at this current moment, it gives natural a rise to gratitude. Does that resonate?
Yeah, that's a very beautifully and powerfully put. I think also just hearing that back at me is like, holy shit, that's holy stuff. Excuse me. That's such a powerful summary of essentially that.
Wow. And it was very visual to me as I was talking about this. And I just so much appreciate your willingness to tell the story because there's so much richness to it. What emotions do you feel at this moment?
I'm impressed by your summary skills. I'm going to have to noodle on this. I'm going to have to sit on this for a while.
Wait, on what? On noodle on what?
And sit on this on the way you summarized this. That was beautiful. Holy moly! Like, did I do that?
Okay, what other emotions besides impressed?
Wow! Props. Joy, levity.
Levity.
Right? As heavy as all that was, like you can just see that scaffolding and those layers and connections, but it's light. It's agile. It's undulating. It's moving. That's how I feel. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for your willingness to tell a heavy story.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for your willingness to put it on your shoulders. And as meaningful and valuable and committed as you are, as I'm sure you already know, the journey ahead of you is not an easy one. Sure. We're all going to be honest with ourselves. We all know that this is not an easy journey. Mm-hmm. And yet you're willing to do it. And I think that is powerful, right? And you're willing to also stand here at this present moment, looking back at the life that led you here and frame it in a way that actually fuels you, not drag you down, because that is another choice we as human beings have. And sometimes we have no other choice but to choose that option because we just feel like we have no other choice, right?
Sure.
But at least at this moment in time, you are willing and able to make that choice and say, I'm going to look back at my past and intentionally focus on the way in which it's actually fueling me, the way in which it's actually providing meaning and value to what I'm doing now. And I'm grateful for that. And with that, I'm willing to commit to the rest, or however many years it may take for you to navigate your mission, to embark on this new path.
I think what's important is I realize that being vulnerable actually helps me. It also is an important way for me to also keep myself honest, because I could also just go on the full tier train and use that as something, but and not maintain the authenticity that I need. And when I'm there, I feel better, and I feel we're able to accomplish so much more, just not in my organization, but going forward. But I think it is so crucial that we're able to be denuded as humans and come back just to that simple existence that we are. It doesn't matter where you're from, how you grew up. You could have grown up as the richest, most blah, blah, or that. It doesn't matter. We're all humans at the end of the day. We all look the same, exact same, actually, on the inside. And it's important for also our projects and approaches like yours to allow others to be okay with it. That you're not going to get fired if you are who you are, if you really are your true self. Because it isn't until we start tearing down the walls, really, that are keeping us apart from moving together as a society, we're not going to get any further. We're not honestly going to deal with issues of climate change, economic inequality, social injustice. And so that's just one step that we can take. And so I also applaud you and your efforts to highlight a few of those, and look forward to what else will come of this. And as you put, you are also heart and soul and experience into it going forward.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Would you be willing to share a little bit about the project that you're working on now, just in case people are interested as they're hearing your story?
Sure, absolutely. It's called Masawa, Masawa. It's the Mental Wellness Impact Fund. And like I mentioned, we're investing in founders with an eye to their own mental wellness and an eye to working with them on maximizing the social impacts, which, according to our thesis and science and common sense, actually increases the return on investment.
Sure.
And you can find that on the interwebs, masawa.fund.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A few things running in my mind. Let me check in with my own emotions. Obvious one, gratitude. Cycles back to the original thing that I mentioned in the beginning. It's been a very humbling thing to reach out to people and seek their willingness to come on a show like this and talk about difficult topics. And I cannot emphasize enough how much I personally appreciate your willingness to come on the show and demonstrate that for myself and others who are viewing this. That just on a personal level means a lot to me. And also, to echo the sentiment that I shared with you earlier, there is this interesting gratitude that arises for me when I recognize that because somebody survived, something was possible. And this is a relatively new realization, because life could have dealt a very different hand, or the person could have responded very differently to the thing that they were dealt. And in just the divergence, a very different choice could have been made, and that person might not have survived, or that person might not have chosen the path that they're on now. And in my book, that's a very small difference, because it just happened. And because you were able to survive the way you survived, you chose the path that you chose. And instead of merely appreciating somebody's efforts, I've, in some spontaneous fashion, felt the urge to express my gratitude towards the fact that you survived at all in the way you survived. So that's something that I really appreciate that you've done. So thank you very much for having done that.
Thank you so much.
Is there anything else that you want to say before we wrap up today?
I'm also grateful for the opportunity. I think for me, healing is not a goal. It is a process. And just speaking to you about this today and putting things together in a way like this is also part of my process. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're very much welcome. And I'm glad that even a smidgen of contribution to your journey, that's an honor and privilege. Thank you very much. You. May you stay beautiful, Joshua.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Hey there, listener. Thank you for listening to the very end. I believe we can mature and innovate by navigating the difficult journey of realizing empathy in the face of tension. What I've learned from my own experience is that all of our challenges in empathizing with others is ultimately an opportunity to realize empathy with ourselves, to develop a greater understanding and appreciation of who we are and who we can be when we feel connected. And this journey is difficult. Let's not sugarcoat it. This is especially so if you go at it alone. So I envision a world where each and every one of us, from the moment we're born until the day we die, can feel certain there's at least one person we can reach out to at any given moment who can and will support us in this journey in a way that actually makes us feel supported. If you share this belief, please subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels, and also like and share this episode, as well as leave a review of our podcast so more people can enjoy it. And if you believe you know somebody who can be a great guest for our show, please send us email at podcast@realizingempathy.com. We absolutely love hearing from you. Thank you once again, and until next time, may you stay beautiful.